I would like to start the very first session of the International Development Select Committee. It is a new committee that we've got here for this new Parliament, and it is my great honour that our very first witness is Professor Nizam Mamode, who is a Professor of Transplant Surgery. But Nizam, you're here in front of us because you have recently returned from Gaza and doing some work in the hospitals over there. We really appreciate you coming and speaking to us today. It's very difficult to get first-hand testimony, obviously, about what's going on in Gaza at the moment. So thank you for coming and sort of sharing your experiences. I wonder if you could sort of properly introduce yourself and what you were actually doing out there and when you came back.
Yes, so I'm no longer a Professor of Transplant Surgery. I retired from the NHS a couple of years ago. And I've spent my time doing work overseas. So I had a month in Gaza, mid-August to mid-September, working in Nasser hospital with medical aid for Palestinians. And I'm happy to tell you about my experiences there.
Please, tell us, so when did you go? Why did you go?
Why did I go? Because I thought I had the skill set that could help. I did, when I was sitting in the convoy, going in across the border, I did have second thoughts, but it was too late then to get out of the convoy. And I think when we crossed the border, the first thing was really a complete sense of shock.
What did you see? What did you smell?
You see a landscape that looks as though it reminded me of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Devastation, buildings reduced to rubble for miles around, as far as you can see. Nothing growing, no people, a few looters here and there, but nothing. You drive through that for about 20 minutes, and then you get to the central part of southern Gaza, which was the designated the green zone. I can't bring myself to call it the safe zone or humanitarian zone because it was neither. That green zone houses about 1.3 million people.
What sort of area is that?
It's probably about the size of the City of London. You can walk across it fairly easily if it was safe to do so. And a large part of it comprises of tents. And when I say tents, some of those are proper tents. Many of them are just pieces of carpet and plastic stuck onto sticks. And these are in the middle of the road, side of the road, every possible space. There's no running water, no sanitation, no electricity, obviously. And people are having to roll those up and move on at very, very short notice. Time and time again, most people have moved 6 or 7 times.
What does it sound, smell?
Well, the sound is mainly of 2 things. One is drones, so there's constant drones. And the drones existed before October last year. It's been a feature of Palestinian life for some time. But now the drones inspire fear, I think, and they inspire fear in me. And when I used to debate about sleeping outside on the stairs or inside in this very crowded hot room, part of that decision was whether the drones had the ability to pick me off when I was on the stairs.
Identify you?
Sorry?
Identify you?
No, shoot me. So that's what they do. Those drones are surveillance drones, but they are also drones that shoot people regularly. And I can tell you more about some of the people I've operated on who experienced that. So you have this constant whine, which is very psychologically very affecting because it represents danger and it's constantly there. And the other sound that you hear are bombs, which were going off every hour or 2 throughout the month that I was there. And we spent the whole month in the hospital. We deemed it not safe to travel. And we were aware that there was a curfew, so we wanted to be in the hospital if casualties arrived at night. We did have a guest house We didn't want to stay there, partly because of the travel, but also because one of the MAP guest houses had been bombed in January of this year. So we stayed in the hospital, and a missile strike or an artillery shell would explode in the vicinity and the whole building would shake. Windows would rattle. You would look out the window or run outside to see how close it was. It was a constant feature of life. We felt we were relatively safe because we thought it's unlikely there'll be a direct strike on the hospital, but for those 1.4 million people in that green zone, they were constantly being bombed day and night. And what I think I found particularly disturbing was that a bomb would drop maybe on a crowded, tented area, and then the drones would come down and...
Please take your time. We're incredibly grateful that you're making the time to be here today, and I can only imagine just how it has impacted you and will continue to impact you. And I feel, because you can't unsee what you've seen, but being able to share that with us really helps us hold legislators particularly to account. So we do appreciate the time that you're making for us today. Thank you.
So the drones would come down and pick off civilians, children, and we had description after description. This is not, an occasional thing. This was day after day after day, operating on children who would say, I was lying on the ground after a bomb had dropped, and this quadcopter came down and hovered over me and shot me. And that's clearly a deliberate act, and it was a persistent act, persistent targeting of civilians day after day. We had 1 or 2 mass casualty incidents every day, and that meant 10 to 20 dead, 20 to 40 seriously injured. Now, a hospital like Guy's, where I used to work, Guy's and St Thomas's, might get 1 or 2 a year. We had 1 or 2 a day. And 60 to 70% of the people we treated were women and children.
I'm sorry to do this, draw you a little. You say children. I wonder if you could tell us sort of the ages of the children. And you say that they said that they were lying on the ground from a bomb shock. Do you believe them?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, a 7-year-old's not going to make up a story.
We're talking little children,
yeah.
not late teens.
Well, from the majority of the children who were casualties were young children, but we had casualties in their teens, we had women in their 30s, and it was a very consistent story. And the story would be given as soon as they came into the emergency department. So I have absolutely no reason to doubt this. And the bullets that the drones fire are these small cuboid pellets, and I fished a number of those out of the abdomen of small children. I think the youngest I operated on was a 3-year-old who had a major injury to the artery in her neck, and we used the last shunt, which is a device you use to bypass the artery in the neck to keep supplying blood to the brain. We used the last one in the hospital because those kinds of things are just not available. She died about 3 or 4 days later from infection.
You believe it was deliberate targeting of civilians?
Absolutely, there's absolutely no question in my mind, and it's been the experience of so many healthcare workers who've documented it time and time and time again. But my personal experience and those of my colleagues was this was clearly persistent, deliberate targeting of civilians. And I've worked in a number of conflict zones in different parts of the world. I was there at the time of the Rwandan genocide. I've never seen anything on this scale, ever. And that was also the view of all the experienced colleagues that I worked with. One of the surgeons in my team had been to Ukraine 5 times and said, this is 10 times worse. Normally in a conflict zone, you would have a front line, you'd have fighting going on between 2 sets of forces, and you might get some civilians injured in that exchange. There doesn't seem to be a front line. There just seems to be 1.4 million people trapped, they can't leave, and having bombs dropped on them on a daily basis, and then drones coming in and shooting them. And there's plenty of evidence out there from Israeli soldiers that that's what's going on. But we saw it, we saw the results of it.
Thank you. Laura.
You talked about a child dying of an infection that was caught. We know that supplies getting in are extremely limited, less now than they have been in the past. Can you talk a bit about the challenges that you face because of the lack of supplies? How does that manifest itself when you're trying to do your medical work?
Yeah, I mean, so I remember one Saturday night operating on an 8-year-old who was bleeding to death, and I asked for a swab, and they said, no more swabs. We had operations being done with no sterile gloves, no sterile drapes at various points. We had lack of basic equipment. I did amputations on people who just had to take paracetamol after the operation as pain relief. That medical aid was sitting at the border and not being allowed in. We were not allowed to take any medical equipment except for personal use. So I was asked, could I bring thyroid medication for some people? Couldn't take it in. That's a deliberate policy. And that's changed because I know that teams earlier in the year had been able to take some medical equipment in. So again, that seems to me to be a deliberate restriction of medical supplies. And basic things like soap, shampoo, that's not being allowed in. I saw, I don't know how many wounds with maggots in. One of my colleagues took maggots out of a child's throat in intensive care. There were flies in the operating theatre landing in the wounds. It was appalling, and that's a deliberate choice. It's not an accident.
In light of those challenges, how did you attempt to manage sterilisation, infection
You just do the best you can, but a large number of our patients, perhaps the majority, I don't know, would survive the operation and die of infections afterwards. And I think, there was a doctor in his 30s who worked in intensive care in the hospital. He got hepatitis A, which is a disease of poor hygiene. It's a disease for which there's a vaccination. I've been vaccinated. He didn't have access to the vaccine. He became unwell. He became a patient in his own ITU. He didn't have the treatment that he could have had in a proper environment, and he died in his own ITU. We asked for him to be evacuated, but he wasn't.
Thank you. It sounds medieval, what you're describing.
Yes, undoubtedly. And remember that Nasser Hospital, at the time that I was there, was probably the best hospital in Gaza. Most other hospitals did not have the facilities and the equipment that Nasser had, and Nasser was barely functioning as a hospital, and was being run by staff, many of whom had very, very little experience, because so many medical staff have been detained, been killed. Some have left when they were able to leave. So in intensive care, for example, was run basically by general practitioners who'd had very minimal training. So the cost in life and in suffering from that side of things is very substantial, because you don't have the equipment, you don't have the staff, you don't have the facilities, and even getting access to the hospital. An ambulance was shot while I was there, several bullet holes in the windscreen while it was going to pick up casualties. I think it's something like 163 or more documented examples of ambulances being targeted. So many people never got an ambulance. People would carry casualties in, sometimes bring them in on donkey carts. And when a mass casualty incident happened, we'd have the whole emergency department full. People would be lying on the floor in pools of blood. And it would be a case of trying to decide who was alive and might survive with some treatment, and who could wait a bit. And that was pretty much every day. And that's been going on for a very long time now.
Sorry, the information you're giving is throwing us, but we're glad that you're giving it to us. Alice?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very powerful testimony. You mentioned at the beginning that about 60%, I think, of the people you were saying were women and children. Can you just expand a little bit more on the kind of effects that you were seeing on women and children? Presumably, there would be pregnant women coming in, for example, just to talk about some of the challenges that you were seeing, particularly when it comes to those two groups of vulnerable people.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to be pregnant in Gaza at the moment. We didn't deal directly with women giving birth. That was dealt with elsewhere, so I didn't have experience of that. But you would have people with blast injuries, abdominal injuries, chest injuries, limbs blown off, head injuries. We saw a number of children with sniper injuries to the head, single shot to the head, no other injuries. So clearly deliberately targeted by Israeli snipers. And yeah, that was day after day.
Maybe just ask a follow-up question in terms of, the horrendous things you're describing, drone targeting, snipers, as you just mentioned. How was that kind of, in terms of what you were seeing happening, how was that kind of, was there a way to kind of bring some of that together in the same way that you're sharing this evidence with us here now? Was that shared back on the ground in different ways with different people?
Do you mean with people in Gaza?
Yeah.
You mean how is it documented? Or?
Yeah, how's it documented, yeah, if it's possible to do that.
It's not really. I mean, the emergency department is chaos most of the time.
Yeah.
There's no, I mean, there are no medical notes anymore. There'll be literally little scraps of paper that people would write something on saying, had an amputation, come back in a week on discharge. That was the extent. I think they documented the admissions, but collecting detailed statistics about causes of the particular trauma is difficult. I think, sorry, just to say one other thing, I think as you probably know, there's been a letter from 32 doctors and nurses from the UK who wrote to Prime Minister back in September. They'd all worked in Gaza, some of them overlapped with me, and 99 in the US who wrote to Biden in October, saying exactly the same things. This is not a surprise. This is something that senior politicians, I'm sure, are well aware of.
Just additional question on this. What was the balance that you were seeing between
people whose injuries and suffering was caused directly by the conflict, e.g. bullets, bombs, shrapnel and so on, versus disease, hunger and other types of illness, affected by living in those conditions.
Yeah, so there were a lot of people with those problems. As a surgeon, I only kind of saw them peripherally coming through. So we would, on a daily basis, there'd be several people coming to the emergency department, for example, with diabetic ketoacidosis. So these would be diabetics who didn't have access to insulin, and then they would develop a diabetic coma. So you have to go back to the 30s and 40s in this country for that to happen. Insulin needs to be kept in a fridge. If you're living in a tent, how do you store it? How do you even get hold of it? So there were lots of those examples. Colleagues who were working in primary care were describing huge amounts of infectious disease, particularly amongst children. We certainly saw malnourished children, and I think that's just getting worse and worse and worse now. And then, of course, there are all the other normal conditions, if you like. So we came across people with bowel cancer, and they got an operation, but it wasn't a curative operation because there's no chemotherapy, no radiotherapy. So all the kind of ancillary services that existed before the war, they had some very good hospitals with very good facilities and very good staff. They've all gone. They've been destroyed. So there's a huge uncounted cost to the war. And there was a paper in the Lancet in July estimating, because of that, both the casualties that had been counted, those that were likely to be under the rubble, and all of those who were dying from other diseases as a result of the war. They estimated conservatively 186,000 dead. That was in those figures up to June. So to my mind, it's over 200,000 now.
Okay.
You talked about colleagues who had been detained and killed.
Yes.
Can you give us an idea of how many colleagues you were working amongst in the hospital?
How many colleagues I was working with?
Yeah, yeah.
Do you mean Palestinian colleagues?
Yes, local colleagues.
Well, there were quite a few. I would have to guess there's probably about 20, 25 doctors in the hospital. Maybe more, I don't know. But there were many, many more before the war, and many of the doctors I was working with had been in the north and had fled the north, and were now making up the numbers in the south.
You also talked about ambulances being targeted. Did you feel safe?
I felt relatively safe in the sense that I thought it was unlikely they'd drop a £2,000 bomb directly on the hospital. But we were worried about drones, couldn't leave the hospital, and travelling in and out was probably the most nerve-wracking thing. So we travelled in and out on a UN convoy in armoured vehicles. That's been shot at 5 times by the Israelis. And these are convoys that are very carefully organised, so they follow a predetermined route given to them by the Israeli army. There's a radio check at the start before they leave, during the journey and at the end, so the Israeli army know that they're there and where they are. And despite that, 5 times, including while we were there, they've been shot at. So my biggest fear while I was there was being killed by the Israelis.
The convoys that were shot at, was this sort of a rogue sniper, or was this...
No, this is the Israeli army coming up as a unit and deliberately shooting. And
UN convoy?
Yes. So the last one, when I was there, I think it would have been about the end of August, was reported, some WHO staff, and these are armoured vehicles, so you can see, I think, 4, 5 bullet marks in the window, just where someone would have been sitting. We were told, given very clear instructions, The doors are going to be locked when you set off. Do not unlock the doors. If the Israeli army shoot at you and order you out, do not get out of the vehicle. This is a UN convoy. It's got UN in big letters on the side. And it carries in twice a week. It carries about 30 to 40 aid workers from different organisations in and out. It's a huge number of aid workers have been targeted, and that's well documented. And again, to my mind, that's a deliberate policy.
Could I ask a question? Sorry, the drone thing, especially when they're shooting at people. These are single shots, or are they machine guns? I mean, are they targeting individual people with a one-off shot, or how does it happen?
Yeah, so luckily I never was anywhere near a drone firing,
yes.
So I can only comment on what we saw when people came in. So we would see people with sometimes a single entry point, sometimes two or three. What we did see on one or two occasions was a very disturbing pattern where there'd be 3 or 4 shots here, 3 or 4 shots here, and again in the groin. And that we all thought was prima facie evidence of an autonomous drone or a semi-autonomous drone, because a human operator would not be able to fire with that degree of accuracy that quickly. And there is some documentation that those were going to be used. It's reported in Haaretz back in April. So that was particularly disturbing. But most of the drone injuries we saw were 1, 2, sometimes 3 shots. And these pellets were in a way more destructive than bullets, because if you're shot in the chest with a bullet, if it misses your heart, goes on the other side, it can go through your lung and out the back. You'll probably survive. But with the drone pellets, what I found was they would go in and they would bounce around. So they would cause multiple injuries. So I had a 7-year-old boy, the one I described earlier, who gave a very clear description. He had an entry point here. He came in with his stomach hanging out of his chest. He had an injury to his liver, spleen. Bowel, arteries. So quite extensive destruction from a single entry point. And he survived that and went out a week later. Whether he's still alive, I don't know.
Thank you for trying. Gordon.
Thank you very much, Nizam, for coming in front of the committee. It's incredibly valuable to hear your testimony, and I have to say, in the 4 months I've been an MP, I don't think I've heard anything as harrowing as what you're describing. So, really appreciate you coming in front of us. I wondered, and I realise this is a difficult question to answer, if you could try and give an estimation of how many lives could be saved, protected by aid that is currently sitting at the border crossing. What is the difference on the ground do you feel that could make with aid that is literally being stopped?
It can make a huge difference. Huge difference. I mean, I've never been in a conflict area where medical aid has been restricted to that extent. I mean, it's not allowing supplies in, bombing healthcare facilities, attacking ambulances, killing healthcare workers. If all of that didn't happen, then tens of thousands of lives would be saved. And I would think that any army that is engaged in a war has a responsibility to the civilian population on both sides. And I'm seeing the opposite there.
I could ask a follow-up question on that. From your experience and your colleagues' experience working in other conflict zones, I mean, how different is this to, you gave even the example of Ukraine, and how different is it from a normal conflict zone in terms of the medical? Completely
different in every respect. And, I think that was a recurring theme from everybody, from people working for the UN, WHO, doctors, everybody. The International Committee of the Red Cross were there, with a field hospital. Most of the time in a conflict zone, the civilian population can move. They can get away from it. They may have to walk a long distance. They may have to suffer doing that. But, it's the equivalent of just putting a blockade around the city of London, saying you can't leave, and then dropping bombs month after month, and then closing down all the healthcare facilities. That's what's happening. And it's astonishing that it's continuing. I mean, we all found that it was beyond belief that this could continue.
Do you regard what you saw as genocide?
I'm not an international human rights lawyer, so I can't talk about the absolute definitions, but it's difficult to find another word for it, given what we've seen, and I certainly think that the Palestinian people feel that that's what's happening to them, and there's a sense of resignation that they're all just waiting to die with no chance of escape. So, in a word, yes.
The Israelis would say that they're dropping leaflets warning people to move to different areas, so it's not targeted at civilians. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's two things. First of all, the green zone, supposedly they're not targeting, so most of our casualties were from the green zone, and many of them had no evacuation, no warning at all, just a bomb would just drop. We had a vehicle blown up 5 metres from the emergency department in the main street. We certainly didn't get any warning, and if I'd been crossing the road to buy something, that would have been the end of me. In terms of evacuation orders, the way it works is they normally send a message out on mobile phones to all the mobile phones saying area number, whatever, evacuation order. So if you have a mobile phone, and if it's charged and working, which is not that easy if you're in a tent, then you might have a chance, but the bombing typically would start sometimes minutes, sometimes hours. So I had one of the Palestinian doctors who worked very closely with me. We were on a ward round one morning, and he suddenly looked at his phone and said, "I've got to go." And he ran out the hospital, ran to find his the tent where his wife, his 2 young children, the youngest was 1.5, and his father were living, and they had to pack up the tent and walk for miles to find somewhere else, all the while thinking at any moment we may have a bomb dropped on us. And that's the day-to-day reality of life for all those people.
You talked about this day-to-day reality. You've talked about children being targeted and healthcare workers being killed, and you talked about a sense of resignation that, a civilian will think they will die. Can you give us a sense of what they think about the international community, or do they think at all about what we could do?
They were very pleased to hear that I'd spoken to some MPs last week. When I messaged the colleagues there and said, "This is what I'm doing," and I said, "Don't know if it'll make much difference," and they said, "Well, small steps." I think they feel abandoned by the international community. They feel, some of them still hope that something might happen. And I think they appreciated hugely the fact that people were coming to help them and stand by them. That was one of the main reasons for going.
Reid.
Thank you. Nizam, thank you for coming and speaking to us today, and thanks for having the strength to share your experiences as well. I know how difficult it must be. Going back to the sort of points around targeting, was there a threat that the Israeli Defence Force was seeing? Was Hamas in the community? Could you see where it was? Or
yeah, I'm laughing because this was the question I asked when I got there. So, is Hamas in the hospital? Have they been in the hospital? And they just laughed at me. And they said, there is no Hamas. There's a few fighters hiding in tunnels. There's no Hamas. There never was any Hamas in the hospital. Everybody hates Hamas. And, we never saw any evidence in the street, in the hospital. As I say, I've been in conflict zones before. Normally, if fighters come in, they come in with guns. They come in with their friends with guns. We never saw any of that. We were allowed to go wherever we wanted in the hospital. There might have been a tunnel underneath, who knows? But if Hamas were coming and going in the hospital, it would have been fairly evident, and I think they would have been probably kicked out by the people that worked there. I remember they described, with ironic laughter, they described one of their colleagues when Nasser Hospital was attacked by the Israelis in February, and they killed a number of staff, put them in a mass grave along with a number of patients. That's well documented. But they described one of their colleagues who was taken away, detained, along with a number of others, who was killed in detention. And they said, well, he was an atheist and he hated Hamas, and he was, before the war, he was very vociferous about those things. He just thought Islam was stupid, and he thought Hamas was stupid, and they took him away and killed him. That's what's going on. It's not as far as I can see, it doesn't matter who you are in Gaza. If you're Palestinian, you're a target.
Thank you.
David and then Noah.
Thank you, Professor. It follows on from what Laura was asking you and what Gordon was asking you, but on the subject of medical supplies, what would you say in the circumstances is the highest need, the highest priority in terms of the particular types of medical supplies that need to get in at this point?
Well, basic medical supplies, so adequate things like gauze swabs, gowns, gloves, antibiotics, painkillers, all those basic things. Those are absolutely essential, but beyond that, you need all of the other ancillary things. You need catheters to put into people. You need specialist imaging techniques and so on. I've been a transplant surgeon for most of my career, so I know quite a bit about dialysis. I used to look every morning on the balcony where our accommodation was in the hospital. I would look across to a building which had been the new dialysis centre built by Kuwaitis, as I understand it. And you can see that building's 100 metres away, burnt out. No shell damage, no bullet holes. There was no firefight there. The Israelis went in and burnt it out. So now they have 6 or 7 dialysis machines, essentially for the whole of southern Gaza. And if you have kidney failure and you don't have dialysis, you die. So, to my mind, that's just not acceptable.
Thank you, Nizam, for sharing these really harrowing experiences. Do you have a sense on the point of being targeted as medical professionals? And you spoke about the information that the defence forces have. I mean, what in your mind did you ever get a sense of any of the motivation behind some of these attacks, or is that very far away and distant for you?
Well, in terms of targeting foreign aid workers, so for example, bombing of the MAP guest house in January, one of the surgeons who was with me was there at the time, and a missile landed just within the grounds in front of the house at 6 a.m. in the morning. Some people were injured. Luckily, nobody was killed. All of those guest houses are in the Israeli Army's computers. They are designated as safe houses. So my assumption is that is a deliberate attack, and that the aim behind it is to discourage aid workers from coming, and I think it's the same as the shooting at the UN convoys. In terms of attacking hospitals and ambulances and so on, to my mind it can't be anything other than collective punishment. It's just a consistent attempt to essentially wipe out a large part of the population. And I think the other theme that comes through again and again when you talk to people is the humiliation, the aggression. So I was operating on one young girl one night who died not long afterwards, and I can't even begin to describe her injuries. But when I'd finished operating on her, an ophthalmologist was trying to take out her left eye, which was just pulp. And he was a lovely, gentle man, maybe 5 years older than me. And he was, while he was working, he was just saying, yeah, when they came in February, they got all of us who were still here, they put our hands behind our backs, tied them up, put a hood over our heads, made us stand for 10 hours, beat us, cursed us in Arabic, humiliated us. And then some were taken away, some were killed, some were detained, some were released. We had a medical student who worked with us, who described how the women had all been lined up and been told to strip down to their underwear and made to stand for hours like that, which is deeply, deeply humiliating, particularly in that culture. And then when they told her she could go, they wouldn't give her her clothes back, so she had to run through the streets like that, which for her was extremely traumatic. So there's a consistent theme of attack, humiliation, aggression against people who are simply trying to do their job, to try and help people in the worst possible circumstances.
You said they did this to the medics. Who?
The Israeli army. Yep.
Sorry, Laura, last question.
You were in Nasser hospital, I think you
yes.
said. The situation in North Gaza is getting a lot of attention now, more attention now, for how awful it is. Did you have any contact with medical professionals trying to work in the north of the country? And
no, only in the sense that I think there was a group of Jordanian doctors sharing the accommodation with us, and 3 of them said we're going to try and get into the north, and they got turned back at essentially a border now, and weren't allowed in. But that was in August, when things were nothing like they are now.
Very last question.
Yeah, just in terms of going back to children and the effects on children, in terms of medical evacuations of children in other conflicts, you have seen that in terms of children being able to be sent elsewhere for treatment. Was that something that was you advocating for in the hospital you're working on? Did you see it happen? And if it didn't, do you think that is something that could be pushed further?
I don't think it's a solution. So there are a tiny, tiny number of people who get evacuated for medical care. If you were to do it in terms of need, it would be thousands going every month, literally. Because what's not picked up by a lot of the statistics is children who've had both legs blown off, people who've got ongoing problems as a result. When I left, the WHO was trying to construct a tented area within the hospital grounds just to deal with constructing prosthetic limbs for people who'd lost limbs in the war. It's a huge, huge number. And of course, one of the acronyms that is now used in Gaza is Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. You have so many children who come in as a result of a missile strike, and all their relatives have been killed. And then eventually somebody pitches up and says, I'm a cousin. I managed to come from a different part of Gaza. But what's happening to the children is appalling.
Professor Nizam, I cannot tell you my gratitude and the gratitude of the committee for both you coming here today, but for the work that you've done. And if you could express our deep thanks to your colleagues who are doing the same work day in, day out, we would be very grateful. And please assure them that you have spoken to us, but we have also heard, and we will do all that we can to act on your very profound testimony. We'll make sure that it's heard for everybody that is in a position to make changes on this horrific situation that you've described so eloquently to us. Thank you so much for your time. I do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Could I ask the next panel members to please step forward? And could I also ask those that are online if they could join us, and can we just check that the sound is working? We can't currently see those that are online. If they could come up on our screens, please. But while we're waiting for our colleagues online, if I could say hello to Sam Rose and Rohan Tolbert. Rohan, you've been in front of us before, so thank you very much for coming back. And it's quite useful to have you on record from, I think it was 9 months ago.
Yes, it was January, yeah.
To look at how the situation has changed in that time.
Mm-hmm.
While we're waiting for our colleagues to join us remotely, Sam, if I could ask both you and Rohan to introduce yourselves and the organisations that you're representing today, please. Sam.
Please, good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity to brief you today. My name is Sam Rose. I'm here representing UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East.
And could I ask you, what does UNRWA actually do?
Yeah, I mean, UNRWA provides education, healthcare, social services, humanitarian aid for 6 million Palestine refugees and other persons registered with UNRWA in Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon, Syria and Jordan. Has operated for 75 years, educated over the course of that time over 2.5 million children, who themselves has gone on to educate much of the rest of the Middle East, particularly the Gulf. Has produced tens of thousands of doctors, healthcare workers, professionals, and is mandated to continue providing services to Palestine refugees and protection until such a time as there is a just, lasting and comprehensive solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And I quite often describe them as like a local authority. Is that sort of the right description, or how would you sum it up?
I think it probably is, with all the kind of foibles that come with being a local authority. In terms of the types of services that we provide, we're running an education system, a health system. We don't run the refugee camps, but we provide municipal type services inside those camps. I think the one...
Is that things like sewage and that kind of stuff?
Sorry?
Sewage?
Sewage, water purification, water supply, drainage, that type of thing. Social services, we've got hundreds of social workers, nurses, sanitation labourers, etc. I think the one key difference between UNRWA and a local authority, at least to a degree, is that we don't have revenue. We don't generate revenue on the back of the services that we provide. We're reliant on voluntary contributions from donors who are primarily the member states of the United Nations.
Thank you. And I'm very pleased that we're joined by our colleagues Amina and Nibral. Nibral, you also came and spoke to us, I think it was in January, so thank you very much. If I can turn to you both in a moment, but Rohan, could you just tell us who you are and the organisation you're representing today?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much for inviting me back. I wish it wasn't necessary, to be perfectly honest, but I appreciate the opportunity to share some updates. My name's Rohan Tolbert. I'm the Director of advocacy and campaigns at Medical Aid for Palestinians. For those of you who don't know MAP's work, we are a humanitarian relief and development agency that began actually working in Lebanon 40 years ago this year, supporting Palestinian refugees, and has since gone on to work obviously in the occupied Palestinian territory. And we have colleagues who are operating and working on the ground, Palestinian colleagues in Gaza, as well as the West Bank and Lebanon, who are currently, of course, largely engaged in humanitarian relief operations.
Thank you. Amina, could I turn to you? I wonder if you could introduce yourself and the organisation that you're working for, and thank you very much for joining us today. It looks much better weather with you than where we are.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Amina Turimovic, and I am an Associate Disability Rights Director at Human Rights Watch. So Human Rights Watch is an international non-governmental organization that monitors human rights development in more than 100 countries around the world, including in Israel and Palestine. And we have a dedicated division working specifically on the rights of persons with disabilities. That's where I work.
Thank you very much. And Nabral, thank you so much for joining us today. I wonder if you can tell us a little about yourself and the organisation you're representing.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me. The Palestine Red Crescent is the lead emergency medical service provider in the occupied Palestinian territory. We provide healthcare services through our hospitals, medical points, and even field hospitals in the Gaza Strip. We also provide emergency medical services across the Gaza Strip, in addition to distributing humanitarian aid, establishing shelters for the internally displaced community, and also providing psychosocial support for the children and women impacted by the ongoing war. This is in addition to other rehabilitation services, working with the people with disabilities, and also doing some community work to raise the awareness of the internally displaced communities, how to protect themselves from infectious diseases and other emergency issues.
Thank you so much. We've got a series of questions that different committee members are going to ask to you individually. We've broken it up into themes, but also I'm very aware that each of you may well have things that you want to add to a question that wasn't directed at you. So in which case, just sort of raise your hand and we'll bring you in if we possibly can. But the first question is from Monica.
Thank you, and thank you for coming in today. This is one for you, Sam. Can we go back to January 2024 and the effects of the withdrawal from major countries following the allegations of staff conspiring with Hamas? What were the long-term, or what will be the long-term effects of that?
Absolutely. I mean, there were, I believe, around 19 countries that suspended funding when the allegations were announced by the Israeli government, amongst them the UK, of course. Now, over a period of several weeks and months, all governments apart from one, that government being the US, did restore and did resume funding. So in terms of overall support, that support, political coming along with the financial, was restored from all but one of the donors. Of course, the one donor that didn't restore funding is by far UNRWA's largest donor. The US typically in any kind of quote-unquote normal year would provide about 30% of any funding that comes to run UNRWA's programs. We typically spend between $1 billion and $1.5 billion a year. This is across all our 5 fields of operation. So any organization that loses that amount of money, it's a shock. It's a shock both in terms of our ability to manage and plan, given the kind of uncertainty of the horizon, both in terms of the supplies that we have to buy to assist a population that remains and was also at that time on the verge of famine. It also creates difficulties in terms of our ability to plan for staffing
and staff salaries, because the bulk of what UNRWA does in all other fields of operations is funded through staff. 80% of what we do are staff salaries, and if we don't know where the money's coming from one month to the next, it makes it very difficult to plan, but also to manage the disquiet and the uncertainty amongst our workforce. So it created all sorts of difficulties, particularly in Gaza. It meant that money that was assigned or budgeted for UNRWA found its way into other organisations' pockets, which is good in terms of the humanitarian community's ability to meet the needs of the population in Gaza, but it also led to concerns that UNRWA was being instrumentalised and that UNRWA's role was being undermined, and that providing this aid through other organisations wasn't always the most efficient way to meet the life-saving needs of the population.
So in terms of the staff that you said, the bulk of your bill was staffing, were those staff laid off? What happened to them in that time?
No, they weren't laid off. It was just that we were never able to guarantee funding for salaries more than for 1 month at a time, and it meant that the majority of the efforts of the senior management team went into raising funds or rather bringing forward funds that had already been committed by those donors that didn't suspend, to try and get those funds brought forward in donor forecasts, which, as we know from the UK side, is something that isn't always very easy to do. These things are very closely managed by the Treasury. At the same time, we had to engage in a concerted effort to provide reassurances to donors who had suspended their funding that the agency was on the right track, that it was doing everything that it could do within its means to respond to and address the allegations. So it's fundraising, but it was also reputation management and risk management, and in other ways as well.
Thank you. Gordon.
Thank you very much. A question for you as well, Sam. I want to ask about the Israeli ban that's passed through the Parliament on UNRWA, and just if you could give us an assessment of the impact that ban is going to have on your staff, as Monica was asking about, but also on the services that you're able to provide to people in need.
Yeah, I mean, on both sides, the impact will be absolutely devastating. I mean, there's no one that has the scale or the scope or the resources or the wherewithal to provide the services that UNRWA is providing in Gaza right now. We're in many ways doing more than we were doing before the war. Before the war, we were providing 1.2 million people with food aid. We're now providing 1.9 million people with food aid. We're assisting hundreds of thousands of people who are registered in UNRWA shelters. These are shelters that were previously schools that have been turned into shelters, not just for the purposes of this war, but in response to previous wars, because the reality for children in Gaza for the past 20 years has been a childhood surrounded by conflict. But the bigger impacts in terms of some of the systems and the public services that we provide, and some of those I described earlier in relation to healthcare, in relation to sanitation, solid waste management, and the kind of broad range of public health services that really can't be picked up very easily, very quickly by other organisations. We're not just talking about rechanneling money over to other organisations. These are health systems and public health systems that have been developed over the course of several decades, and that now is in jeopardy. And with that, you're risking an environment where when people are living in the squalor that they're living in, the risk of infectious diseases re-emerging, as we saw with polio just a few months ago, is incredibly high, and for the staff it creates major uncertainty as well, not just in Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and parts of South Lebanon, where if applied to the letter, the Knesset bills could also suspend or UNRWA's ability to operate, but across the entire body of staff for two reasons really. One is what this means for their issue, the Palestinian issue, and that being taken outside of agreed political parameters and the frameworks of international law in which we operate in Gaza, but elsewhere, but also in terms of their own immediate futures, because in Gaza we've got 13,000 staff, in the West Bank we've got 3,000 staff out of a body of about 30,000. If those staff stop working, and money has to be withdrawn from the equivalent that we have of a pension fund, then it places the entire instrument in real jeopardy, and it will also have an impact on donor funding decisions around UNRWA, which could make it increasingly difficult for those staff to continue their functions.
Are there any steps that you can take to mitigate it? It sounds like it's obviously incredibly difficult, but I just wonder if you could give us an overview of what UNRWA has done since this was passed.
Yeah, we are advocating in the first instance. UNRWA is an organ of the United Nations General Assembly, so any changes to its mandate should come through that vehicle. We're advocating at the highest levels with the General Assembly through our kind of governing organ. We are advocating with member states to exert the influence that they have on the government of Israel to not implement the bill. We are working with, as we continue to work with other UN organizations to understand what the impacts of any changes to UNRWA's ability to operate would be, but we're not in a position right now to engage in detailed contingency planning, really, because if we were to do that, it could be seen as facilitating a decision which runs contrary to the principles of the United Nations and the UN Charter, but also secondly, because the types of services that UNRWA provides, while some, such as delivery of food aid, could in theory be picked up by others, the systems that we're running, the education system that we're running, the health system that we're running, the solid waste management systems, they're not things that can be handed over in a space of 90 days.
And that's something which has been perplexing me, because an occupying country has a duty to civilians to provide basic services, which really UNRWA has been providing. So have Israeli politicians been debating how they will be able to deliver those legal services?
Not as far as I'm aware, but it has been made clear to the government of Israel, including recently by the Secretary General of the United Nations, that it would be Israel's responsibility to provide those services in accordance with international law and the responsibilities upon an occupying power. But we're not seeing any moves in that direction, at least not so far.
Thank you. No.
Thank you, Sam. So picking up from there, and actually to Rohan and also Nabal as well, to what extent can your organisations actually work to fill the void that we're getting a sense of there?
It would be impossible. Not just for obviously organisations like Medical Aid for Palestinians, but it's the clear position across the humanitarian sector that we as a collective will not be able to fill that gap. There's two issues here. One, that UNRWA is the backbone of the humanitarian system in Gaza, both in terms of its logistics, provision of things like fuel that we depend on in order to run our operations, and various support there. But the closure of UNRWA's clinics would be far beyond our capacity to meet, and far beyond the capacity of any other agency to meet, or the collective of those agencies. There is. It would create, it's already a humanitarian catastrophe, but it would be total system collapse. And so I think, as Sam has just said, I think we need to be very careful about focusing our minds on contingency planning. Obviously, we always need to keep all possibilities under review, but our first and primary priority needs to be to protect UNRWA and to make sure that it is not dismantled in any format, because there is no viable contingency in the immediate future or the long-term future that would meet the needs of the people that it serves.
And Nabal, did you have?
We at the Palestine Red Crescent have the same position. So no local or international party could fulfill the gap that UNRWA would have. No one have the infrastructure or the means to do that. So absolutely banning UNRWA would have catastrophic consequences on the civilians and the humanitarian response in the Gaza Strip. This also not only including the entry of aid into Gaza, including also fuel essentials to EMS and health services, much of which relies on logistics and trucking managed by UNRWA. This will also even affect the entire humanitarian response, as UNRWA is the backbone for the humanitarian response.
Thanks very much, Sam. I just had a follow-up question to you. UNRWA's doing essential work in Gaza, and it's welcome that the UK government has restored funding. Wondered if you could briefly outline, though, in relation to the Kelowna report, the reforms and changes that you've seen UNRWA implement, specifically around vetting of staff.
Yeah, I mean, we share the names of all our staff with all host authorities, including the government of Israel, who aren't a host, but with whom we share them. We've been doing that for the past 15 years. We do it twice a year. We continue to do that. We continue to share the coordinates of all our locations and all our facilities with the Israeli government on a daily basis as well. And as you may know, until the 27th of January, or whenever it was of this year, or end of January this year, not once had we received any response from the Israeli authorities in relation to that list of names that had been provided. Now, since the Kelowna report has been issued, and that report did speak to the high standards and the systems, the robust systems, I think the most robust system amongst any UN agency that exists. We have taken additional measures and additional steps, really just to get on top and remain on top what remains a very fluid, a very difficult, a very politicized and fragile environment inside Gaza and in other fields of operation. And we put in place a number of measures to provide more systematic, more regular quarterly briefings to our key donors on what it is that we're doing, the reality of the situation on the ground, so that we can keep apprised and keep on top of what is happening, any changes to the environment. We've hired and are in the process of setting up a risk management unit within the organisation. It's something that we'd wanted to do for several years, but just wasn't possible because of a lack of resources. So a number of senior staff have been brought in to actually provide some focused effort to that initiative, which, even if we get through this, will remain something that we have to keep on top of for the past for the coming years. We're not.
If you want to get more on record, do you want to write to us on that? It's just I'm very minded. We've got an awful lot of questions.
Okay.
Alice.
Yeah, just a question. You've obviously very clearly the message is that there isn't an alternative in terms of some of the services provided. What is the timeline? And you mentioned, the UN General Assembly, it being a body under that. What is the timeline and your, optimism, I guess, around any change in the ban not going ahead? And if the UK government was going to put pressure on at certain points, is there more that you would like the government to be doing right now?
Yeah, I mean, the bills were passed on the 28th of October with a 90-day time frame for implementation, and also, I believe, a requirement that the whatever committee report back on progress every 6 months in relation to their implementation. We didn't. A letter was sent to the chef de cabinet of the United Nations about 10 days ago, basically saying that the laws were now coming into effect and essentially that the clock had started ticking. I mean, as we've seen with the 30-day notice period that the Americans gave for the improvements in the importation of aid, we don't know precisely when when this will come into effect, precisely down to the day, but we're planning on essentially 80 days from now. Now, what that means precisely, given the lack of specificity in the letters, I mean, we're literally talking about a couple of sentences is what we have received. In terms of details, remains to be seen. So we're pushing on member states through, entities like this, just to highlight the impact of it, the criticality of it, the lack of or the obligations of member states in relation to meeting the findings of the ICJ ruling in earlier this year, and the obligations on Israel to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid, and that a decision to dismantle UNRWA would completely go against that. And we call on the UK government and other member states to do what they can with the political capital, the advocacy, the lobbying that they have, both directly but also through the Security Council and through any influence that you have with other member states.
Thank you. Can I bring Brian in, please?
Thank you. I've got some questions on healthcare facilities, but before we move on to that, I wonder, Sam, if you could tell us a little bit about basic water supply and how that is dealt with. Are you dealing with desalination? Are you dealing with water that's pumped from Israel? How is water getting to the people?
Sam, can I ask for a very brief answer, please?
Yeah, I mean, water was difficult before the war. Water comes into Gaza in really three ways, or water is available in three ways. There are 3 Israeli lines that come in. There are desalination plants, and there are water wells, including many that UNRWA operates. The desalination plant has at times been unable to operate due to lack of fuel, due to lack of supplies. My understanding right now is that the main desalination plant in Deir al-Balah in central Gaza is functioning. Water wells, our ability to function is dependent on access and fuel and supplies as well. So we have 6, I believe, water wells in Jabalia camp. None of those have been operating now for several weeks because lack of fuel, because lack of ability to reach them. Now, the Mekarot lines, the 3 lines from Israel has said a lot about restoring those lines at different points in time. But even when those lines are restored, if the infrastructure itself is damaged through the intensity of the conflict, and the municipal staff haven't been able to reach to repair it, which they haven't, and on many occasions have been killed whilst trying to carry out their duties, the fact that the lines are open does not mean that people are able to meet their needs for water, particularly in an environment where almost everyone is displaced, and water, as anywhere in Gaza, is set up to provide for people where they are. If you've got hundreds of thousands of people in displacement camps on the beach, there isn't the water infrastructure there to support them, so it has to be trucked in, it has to be brought in.
Sure, so sorry to labour the point, but it's quite an important one. But how do people collect the water then? Do they go with small buckets or with?
Yeah, I mean, your life as a child right now starts in Gaza walking along with your yellow jerry can or your yellow bucket, queuing up on the side of a road where a water truck comes past, and you even see kind of rows of hundreds of jerry cans just laid up, all in very kind of neat order as people. That's one of their daily.
Thank you for painting that picture. Sorry. So to Rohan, if could you outline the current state of healthcare facilities across Gaza?
Yeah, of course. So just to go back to January, at that point we were warning about the systematic dismantling of the healthcare system. That has continued unabated. In terms of hospitals, there are now no fully functioning hospitals left in Gaza. There are 17 out of 36 which are partially functioning, and partial functioning in some cases is incredibly minimal. I'll get on to Kamal Adwan in a minute, but that from a sort of a medium-sized hospital now has 2 paediatricians and one general practitioner treating a patient load of 120 plus casualties coming in. So that's what a partially functioning hospital might be. There are currently 14,000 patients in need of medical evacuation. That's only the most critical cases. That evades, the point of the many who would normally be travelling to East Jerusalem and other places for example, cancer treatment or other treatments, as they would have done before October last year. The civil defence and ambulance services, I'm sure Nabal can speak to this point as well, are hugely restricted, both in terms of their operating environment and their ability to reach people, but particularly up in the north, the civil defence in North Gaza has essentially suspended all operations, both because they don't have fuel, but they also don't have security. They can't run their ambulances, they can't reach people because of insecurity. So the health system is in a state of steady collapse. It is most intensive, that collapse, in the north at the moment, where there are 3 hospitals on very minimal functioning because there is no aid reaching them, no medical supplies. They have several of them have had large proportions of their staff forced to flee the hospitals to go south, or, as you've heard earlier, have either been arrested, detained, or killed.
Thank you, Sam. What's been the long-term impact of people going without their medicine and routine treatment?
Yeah, I mean, more people will die, more people will suffer, more children will grow up unable to meet their potential in terms of contributing to society. So it has devastating impacts on individual levels, family levels, but also on the impact on the level of the society as a whole. I mean, we heard earlier, as well as the 43,000 people that have been killed and over 100,000 injured, there are many that are just going without in terms of routine care, routine treatment. This includes, elderly or middle-aged who've got, sedentary diseases, diabetes, hypertension, things like that, cancer treatment, as well as people who've fallen sick as a result of the conflict, who aren't able to get the care that they need. So the children who develop paralysis as a result of polio. Mm-hmm. Polio can't be cured, but if you get to a hospital and you get some treatment, mm-hmm. you can even palliative, and so it can help you deal with some of the worst impacts of it. But all of that really has been is gone or is going. And you've also got a medical workforce that themselves have gone through unbelievable trauma and are also suffering. So their ability to tend to the needs of the people as well, which they do, remarkably above and beyond anything mm-hmm. we've ever seen in recent memory. But their ability to continue providing that care as well is massively, massively constrained.
Amina, we can see you trying to get in, and I think Brian's got questions for you as well.
I was going to go to you next, Amina. We've heard so many stories today. In your opinion, do Israeli attacks on Gazan hospitals violate international law?
And is that a question for me?
Yes.
Yes, please.
No. Human Rights Watch has reported that attacks on healthcare facilities, including medical transportation in Gaza, by Israeli army has been unlawful. And what I wanted to chime in on are the few questions that were already raised in terms of long-term impacts of the lack of access to healthcare, as well as immediate impact. So for my report, for example, I interviewed Layan, who is a 12-year-old girl who was injured in an Israeli airstrike. Because she was not able to access immediate and urgent and adequate healthcare, by the time she reached Egypt, where she was evacuated for healthcare, her wounds became so gangrenous that she had to have her leg amputated. So here we are talking about a child who didn't lose a limb in a traumatic amputation, but lost a limb because it took days for her to access adequate healthcare. In terms of long-term impacts, the report that I recently put out documents that children with disabilities and chronic health conditions who used to receive regular medical treatment prior to October 7th and have not been able to receive it since then, have faced serious health consequences. just to give you another illustration that stayed with me since I heard about it, think about babies born with clubfoot condition. Clubfoot is a condition that's treatable in any place in the world that has a functioning healthcare system. But Dr. Anna Jelani, who is an orthopedic surgeon, she told me that when she was in Gaza, she saw 4 babies who were brought to her who had a clubfoot condition. And she told me these babies are going to grow up having a disability. And the only reason why is because the only facility in Gaza that was able to provide casting and bracing for babies born with clubfoot has been demolished and closed. And the only person who was trained to cast babies with clubfoot condition has been killed. And so what we will see is, as doctors told me over and over again for the report that I worked on, is that children with disabilities will either die or their disabilities will become more complex because they don't have access to healthcare.
Thank you. Sam, can I bring you in?
Sure, thank you. We heard earlier about the lack of medical aid and basic medical equipment getting in. My question's to Nabal. Since you appeared before the committee in January, has the situation with regards to border checks improved?
Unfortunately, since January, the situation is only getting worse. In May, the Rafah crossing has been closed, and this has affected the entry of humanitarian aid. Israel is still obstructing the entry of humanitarian aid. Before May, the Palestine Red Crescent managed to receive thousands of aid trucks. Despite it was the minimum, it is not enough. But I can tell you, since May until this moment, we only received 65 aid trucks through other crossing points because Rafah crossing is still closed. And instead of increasing the entry of humanitarian aid, we're getting less aid that is getting in through all crossing points that are currently opened. And that's why the humanitarian situation is only deteriorating, and the healthcare system is also continue to collapse because all hospitals in Gaza are lacking medications, medical supplies, and even fuel, which is urgently needed for the power generators. As the Palestine Red Crescent, many of our ambulances had to stop operating many times because of fuel depletion. We also suffer, as other healthcare providers, in our hospitals and our medical points across the Gaza Strip. We suffer because of the shortages of medications and medical supplies. And this is a real problem while the war is only getting intense, and we are in need for more humanitarian aid. This includes food, relief items, in addition to medications. The aid is still getting in a very minimum basis, which is not even scratching the surface of the needs. And that's why the Palestine Red Crescent also continue to recall for safe, sustained, unembedded humanitarian aid access to all areas of Gaza. We do not need 20 or 30 trucks to enter per day. We need enough aid to get in. And this should be getting in without any limitations, without restrictions, and to be able to deliver to all the people across the Gaza Strip, including the people who are currently trapped in north of Gaza. For over 40 days, the people in north of Gaza have not been able to receive any aid. This means no food, no water, no medications, and nothing. And the situation is unimaginable. I can't even describe the situation for civilians in north of Gaza. I can tell you, as the Palestine Red Crescent, currently there is not even a single ambulance that is operating in the besieged area in northern Gaza. And this means Jabalia refugee camp, Beit Lahia, and Beit Hanun. However, the Palestine Red Crescent, we are exist. Like, we are operating in north of Gaza, but not in the besieged area. We work in the the southern parts of the northern governorate. So we have very restricted access. We can't reach any of the besieged areas. And unfortunately, despite getting calls from people who are appealed to us to send an ambulance, we feel helpless because these areas are considered as red zones by the Israeli, and we are completely denied access to it. Any ambulance to try to reach will be targeted. And this means people bleed to death. And this is literally means bleed to death without being able to receive emergency medical care. And those who are lucky enough to be transported even by donkey carts to be sent to the hospital, they are sent to one of the 3 remained hospitals who are in a catastrophic conditions. And currently we are organizing evacuation missions in coordination with the WHO and the ICRC from time to time to evacuate the patients from north of Gaza to other hospitals who are still operating in Gaza City. I would like here to add one point which is necessary to our session today. The session question is like, how bad is the situation in terms of the healthcare? The situation is beyond catastrophic, is unimaginable, and it will continue to stay bad because of the unimaginable attacks that is happening in unprecedented scale. It never happened because we are seeing more hospitals being taken out of service. The Palestine Red Crescent runs only 2 hospitals, and both of them were taken out of service. Al-Quds Hospital in Gaza City was taken out of service at the beginning of the war after it was besieged, attacked, forcing everyone to evacuate the hospital, including the medical staff and patients. Later, it was burned out, and now the hospital, everything inside it is damaged. So even if the war ends, we will need a good time to be able to reoperate the hospital again. The second hospital for the Palestine Red Crescent, Al-Amal Hospital, which is in south of Gaza, was also attacked, repeatedly besieged, and then raided by the Israeli forces, where they arrested a number of our medical staff and volunteers, and later forced the hospital to be evacuated, damaged the hospital, and gladly we managed to reoperate the hospital again so it can provide its healthcare services for the people in the south, taking into consideration that Al-Amal Hospital in the south is one of the major hospitals. The situation in the south, as you know, the majority of population were forced to flee towards the south, and there is a lack of healthcare services being provided, especially for people with chronic diseases, pregnant women, and other cases, because primary hospitals can barely provide life-saving services for wounded who are trauma patients because of the bombardment. And that means pregnant women, children who are sick, have infectious diseases, and other cases, they go out without any services. And this is what we try to provide through our hospital, and we managed to establish other 25 medical points across the Gaza Strip to provide essential healthcare services to the community. I have lost 19 PRCS members, and all of them were killed on line of duty.
Nabal, thank you so much. You have really painted very, very clearly what the situation is. And can I say thank you to you, to your staff, and to all the volunteers in the Palestinian Red Crescent. The work you have done has been truly remarkable. And may I also pay tribute to your colleagues who have been killed trying to do their duty to the people that they are trying to serve and support. The committee went out to Al Arish and we met your counterparts, the Egyptian Red Crescent, and so we saw firsthand the frustrations that were put in place on the border control, and my admiration for your organisation and theirs knows no bounds. But could I just clarify one point that you said? You said that 65 trucks have just got in. Today was the deadline.
For the Palestine Red Crescent.
Yes, sorry. Today was the deadline set by the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, to the Israeli government to return to just 350, and I think when we spoke in January we were looking at 500 a day as the absolute bare minimum when there were still reserves in warehouses. So can you tell me, are you seeing any indication based on that deadline set by the US government that aid is going to get in now?
Unfortunately, based on the figures from last month, we are only receiving less aid than the previous month. And as for the north of Gaza, nothing managed to get in. We hope that to witness a real increase in the entry of a humanitarian aid. As I said, we really need safe and sustained entry of a humanitarian aid to be able to deliver this essential aid to all the peoples of Gaza. And we also need protection for hospitals. The situation will continue to be worsened if no serious action is to be taken. Our call for the international community is to take serious measures to protect hospitals and medical personnel. No hospital should be attacked. And as I said, I have lost 19 PRCS members. All of them were killed in line of duty when they were trying to save others' people's life. This should never happen. Paramedics should be respected and protected and allowed to do their job safely while they are trying to do others. But unfortunately, my colleagues have to say goodbye for their families every single day, not knowing if they are going to meet them at the end of their shifts because of the great dangers they endure every single minute when they are trying to save other people's life.
I cannot even begin to imagine what that must feel like, and I'm just incredibly grateful to your colleagues for trying to get up every morning and do the best by the civilians that they're trying to serve. I want to bring in Rohan and then hand back to Sam, if I may.
Just because you raised the US letter from Blinken and Austin, which I think is important, the deadline was today. I just wanted to draw the committee's attention to an independent scorecard by humanitarian agencies that was released just today. That includes the NRC, Oxfam, Save the Children and others. Essentially, they broke down the demands that were made of Israel into a number of criteria. And analysed essentially over the last 30 days, have any of those been met? Not a single one has been fully implemented. I think 2 have been partially implemented. So the demands 350 trucks to be entering per day. Actually, over this last 30 days, we've seen some of the lowest number of trucks entering Gaza during the entire year, 42 per day on average. That's compared to 500 before the beginning of the conflict. Some days as few as 6. Humanitarian pauses to enable aid, not implemented. Improving security for humanitarian operations, not implemented. 50 to 100 commercial trucks to be allowed to enter, not implemented. ICRC access to detainees that we've heard about, including medical staff, not implemented. Ending the isolation of North Gaza, clearly not implemented and getting much worse. So I just want to say that across the board on every indicator, Israel is not complying with what is being demanded of it by the US. And also we have our own scorecard. I'm happy to share that with the committee. We have our own scorecard with regards to the implementation of the ICJ's, the International Court of Justice's provisional measures in January, March and May to prevent genocide. And again, across the board, every single provisional measure has not been implemented. So, as Nabil has just mentioned, our message is that a strategy focusing on aid but without accountability, without some form of countermeasure to address the fact that Israel is not acting in good faith with regards to its obligations as an occupying power, that strategy has failed. We need a rethink on the way that those interactions and those relations with Israel function if we are to see any form of meaningful aid response in Gaza and prevent further catastrophe.
Thank you very much. Sam?
Yeah, I would be grateful just to actually ask one more question. And Chair, let me know if this is sort of beyond the remit of this discussion, but there's been clear evidence presented today of what I would say constitutes breaches of international law, including targeting the symbol of the Red Crescent and blocking aid. I'd be interested to know what sort of evidence gathering is taking place, because at some point there will need to be accountability. and justice, and whether there is any active operation to start to look at which individuals are committing which acts.
Can I ask Amina to answer that, please?
Thank you so much. Already in November, I put out the first report on the situation of people with disabilities in Gaza, where we clearly said that Israeli evacuation orders are not taking into account the needs of people with disabilities who cannot evacuate, and that they are actually putting them at higher risk of death and injury. I interviewed dozens of people with disabilities and children, including a 14-year-old girl who had to beg her parents to leave her behind because she felt that she was a burden on them as they tried to carry her down to the south. Because she had cerebral palsy, she lost her assistive devices in an attack on her home. And then literally 2 days after she lost her assistive devices, Israel ordered everyone to evacuate from the north to the south. And one of our partners actually in Gaza, who was a 39-year-old man who was blind, ended up being killed because he could not evacuate. And this Thursday, so in 2 days, Human Rights Watch is releasing a report on displacement and humanitarian destruction in Gaza, a definitive finding of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And as part of this report, we also document that the Israelis' destruction of the infrastructure, including the healthcare system, including through sometimes reckless but often intentional attacks on hospitals, that this is all building and providing mounting evidence that Israeli authorities have no intention to allow people to return to their homes. So this report is coming out on Thursday, and over the last year we have reported also, I do want to come back to Professor Mamode. He did speak about the mental health harm caused to healthcare workers in Gaza. And our report on detention of healthcare workers, where we did document that Israeli military intentionally detained healthcare workers in Gaza. And the healthcare workers that we spoke with told us about the mental health harm and trauma that they have been through, that even though they have gone back to work, they continue to be traumatized. And specifically to also just add, because what was really important, what Nabal said about the restrictions for humanitarian aid, but what we don't hear as much about is the specific restriction that Israeli authorities have imposed that are particularly harming children and adults with disabilities. And it is the restrictions that Israeli authorities have imposed on so-called dual-use items. These items are civilian items. We are talking about eyeglasses, wheelchairs, walkers, that Israel claims cannot enter Gaza because of security reasons. Israel claims that these items can be used in military purposes. And in fact, even what we have heard from the Foreign Office is that even the aid provided by the UK government, the aid that the UK government is trying to provide to Palestinians in Gaza, the warehouse is piled up with wheelchairs that cannot enter because of these specific restrictions. And because people with disabilities do not have access to assistive devices that are essential, they are at high risk of dying because it's harder for them to flee. They are at high risk of infections because it's harder for them to access. Talking about water, something that Sam spoke about earlier, it is difficult for anyone in Gaza to access water. Just imagine how it's more difficult for people with disabilities, and specifically if they don't have access to assistive devices. But then also what we have documented when it comes to children is that because they don't have access to assistive devices, such as, for example, a medical boot or a walker or a wheelchair, and then coupled with lack of access to healthcare, their conditions have worsened. So just to say that there's lots of evidence already out there. And Human Rights Watch has been calling and continues to call on the UK to take more concrete steps in condemning the war crime and condemning the violations of international humanitarian law, and take persuasive efforts to press Israel to comply with international humanitarian law. Something that I would also like to speak about, whether now or later. But there are things that can be done. Just briefly, earlier there was a question about.
If we can do that later, that would be great. And maybe if you could write to the committee on those recommendations, we'd be very grateful to hear. I'm going to say to everybody, we still have more questions. We still want to hear from you, but I am going to have to ask people to speed up their answers. But Nabal, you wanted to come back in?
I really want to stress out the importance of the protection, and there was a question regarding the violating the international humanitarian law. Unfortunately, we have lost 19 and no international organizations or no serious actions were taken by any country, despite we have very horrific conditions where our paramedics were attacked despite being part of coordinated missions. And coordinated missions mean there is a deliberate target, because Israeli authorities are very well known of the ambulance's plate number, of the staff names, their ID numbers, and despite this coordination, which was taken to ensure the safety of the staff, they deliberately target our staff. And here I can't go without recalling the story of both of my colleagues, Yusuf Zeno and Ahmed al-Madhoun, who were killed when they were trying to rescue the 6-year-old Hind Rajab. This happened on January 29, when Hind Rajab was in her family car with her relatives trying to evacuate Gaza city. Israeli forces opened fire at the family, killed everyone except Hind and her cousin. She was 15 years old, Layan. Layan was over the phone with our dispatcher. She was screaming, "They are firing at us," and she was shot while she was over the phone with the Palestine Red Crescent dispatcher. We called the same number again, and Hind picked up the phone, and we had the most devastating, heartbreaking, the longest call in the history of the Palestine Red Crescent. For 3 hours, this little girl was begging our dispatcher to send her an ambulance, to send someone to save her. She was terrified, screaming, shouting, hearing the sound of gunshots all the time, saying the tanks are close to me, and at the same time surrounded by the dead bodies of her family. For 3 hours, she was only asking for help, and unfortunately, we could not send someone to save her right away. We had to coordinate safe access for our staff. It took us 3 hours to coordinate the safe access. And unfortunately, after that, when the ambulance was dispatched, it turns out that the ambulance was bombed upon its arrival. And guess what? It took us 12 days of uncertainty, not knowing of our colleague Yusuf and Ahmed managed to rescue Hind or not. And then after the withdrawal of Israeli forces, we learned that the ambulance was bombed, Hind was killed, and our paramedics were meters away far from Hind cars. How come a story like that to pass without anything, without even accountability? I can't even imagine that the families of both Yusuf and Ahmed, every single day, they are still grieving their loss. And I can't even imagine the pain they endure every single day. They didn't even get the chance to say goodbye for them, because remains of their bodies were collected from the ambulance. And Yusuf has 5 children. 2 of them are twins. They are little girls, 2 years old. Up to this moment, when they hear the siren of ambulance, they think their dad came back. It's just a shame in humanity and a shame on the international community that medical personnel lose their life while they are trying to save others. It's not a single incident. We have another story where also my colleague Muhammad al-Umari was killed while trying to evacuate patients from Gaza hospitals to the south. It was a coordinated mission by the ICRC. It took us 1 week to coordinate the mission, and after they managed to evacuate patients from Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital, Israeli forces opened fire at a convoy of the ambulances, killing my colleague Muhammad al-Umari and injured other while inside the ambulance was patients who are children. Children who are patients need to be evacuated to the south, endangering the life of patients, killing medical staff despite coordination. This will continue to happen since there is no serious consequences taken. My colleague Hidayah, she is the manager of Youth and Volunteers Department. She was at Al-Amal Hospital in Khan Yunis at a time when it was besieged. The hospital was attacked. There was injuries. She rushed to save one of the injuries, and a sniper shot her and killed her. And the bullet came in through this Red Crescent emblem, which should have provided her protection. I have spoken to my colleague Amir. Amir, he is a volunteer, and he was grieving in pain the loss of Hidayah, and he told me, I can't imagine, we lost Hidayah, she's like my mom, and I can't imagine that the bullet just came in through her vest, her Red Crescent, and killed her. I can't imagine how after the end of the war, I'm going to have dissemination and IHL session for the new volunteers, teaching them about the Red Cross and Red Crescent emblem, which should provide them protection. Unfortunately, months later, Emil also was killed, shot by a sniper while he was inside Al-Amal Hospital.
I am personally ashamed that the international community has not done more to stop the horror that you're describing. And any attack on an aid worker is a disgusting, despicable, wicked thing. And there are laws in place, and they need to be honoured by everybody. And I am truly sorry for the loss of your colleagues, and I am truly grateful that you have shared their stories so that their deaths are able to be recognised, honoured, and I hope are able to help us prevent what's going on. Thank you very much for sharing that. I want to, Rohan, you wanted to come in.
Be as brief as I can.
I'm really sorry, everybody. We do want to hear what you're saying. I know that we're going to run out of time, so I will ask all of you if you want to write to us. I know it's not the same, but we do want to hear everything that you're saying. We do want to document it, and we do want it to make a difference. But I am very aware that we're pushing up against time now. So if I could ask people to make statements wherever they can, I'd be very, very grateful. Rohan.
Thank you. And I wanted to address the point head on. One of the provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice to prevent genocide was that the State of Israel shall take effective measures to prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence related to allegations of acts within the scope of the Genocide Convention. No forensic specialists have been able to enter, no independent human rights experts have been able to enter, no international media have been able to enter, etc. And to be perfectly honest, humanitarian agencies feel that there's a sort of Damocles hanging over us if we speak out too strongly on issues of accountability, though they are so essential for the protection of the people that we serve. I do want to register, however, there has been, based on expert testimony and open source information, at least one major investigation by an independent UN Commission of Inquiry set up by the Human Rights Council, which found just over a month ago that Israel has implemented a concerted policy to destroy the healthcare system of Gaza. Israeli security forces have deliberately killed, wounded, arrested, detained, mistreated and tortured medical personnel and targeted medical vehicles, constituting the war crime of willful killing and mistreatment and the crime against humanity of extermination. Israeli authorities carried out such acts while tightening the siege of Gaza Strip in the context of collective punishment of the Palestinian population of Gaza. So there is already on record an independent body that has found that Israel is violating international law, is committing war crimes, is committing the crime against humanity of extermination. Extermination under the Rome Statute is the killing of persons, including by inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of part of the population. It is our assessment that this is a war on Palestinians, that the humanitarian crisis is not some accidental byproduct, but across the board, as you've heard from doctors there, from our own agencies, from Palestinians themselves. You ask any independent observer or any person on the ground, they will tell you that this is a situation of mass atrocities. And therefore, the approach that the government takes simply cannot be based purely on aid alone. What is the point of providing for funding for UNRWA if Israel is going to dismantle UNRWA's services? What is the point of providing aid that comes into Al Arish and you see it packing up at the border if it's not allowed to enter? If it does enter, then there's no security, so it can't be distributed. There's no warehousing, there's no fuel. It's besieged from the north of Gaza. Our colleagues tell us every single day that it's hell. And what I'm really worried about is my colleagues, when I ask them, what do you want me to say in front of these people? They say, don't bother. Don't bother. It doesn't matter anymore. We're waiting to die. Thank you.
Thank you. Alice.
Thanks very much for a very powerful testimony. Just moving on to the issue of hunger, malnutrition and famine. Sam, just a kind of, I guess, a factual question. Has the availability of food improved since you were speaking to the committee in January?
No, I spoke to the committee in November, I think, but no, the situation in terms of availability of food in Gaza is, I left last Thursday, is back to what it was in last November in terms of the non-functioning of the private sector, the lack of humanitarian supplies, as many other witnesses have already said in relation to the number of trucks going in, which is a bad metric, but it is the metric that we're using, but also in relation to the siege of northern Gaza, where no supplies have got in now for over a month, where the little reserves that there were available at the time the siege was put into effect have all dwindled away into nothing. And the ability for bakeries and other food producers in Gaza to operate is also, massively constrained.
Thank you. And moving on to Amina, and we've been talking for a long time about famine looming and starvation looming large. There is still a high risk of famine. At what point is starvation deemed a weapon of war under international law? And do you think that's what's happening right now?
We have reported and documented that Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war against Palestinians in Gaza. And particularly from the perspective of children with disabilities who are in general at high risk of malnourishment. Many of those children who have died had a disability. And what we have documented and reported on is that even with the trickle of aid that has been going in, the food items needed by children with disabilities and adults with disabilities did not come in, like the special food items did not come in. And over and again, Human Rights Watch has been reporting that Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war, as well as collective punishment of the Palestinian people by cutting off electricity, water, food, medical supplies. And I do want to emphasize something. Rohan mentioned earlier the Commission of Inquiry, but we should also recognize that the UK government has concluded that there is a clear risk that UK components could be used by Israel to facilitate or to commit serious violation of IHL. And because of that, the UK government has suspended the F-35 parts from going directly to Israel. So even the UK government has recognized that directly or indirectly that Israel is committing serious violations of international humanitarian law. And it is something to keep in mind and to take tangible actions to press Israel to press for accountability and justice. And if I can, I don't know if it's time for now just to provide some concrete asks of what the UK could be doing going forward.
Very briefly, please, Amina.
So a few things. One is to suspend all arms military assistance to Israel, including arms that could go to Israel indirectly via the US or other third countries. We are calling on the UK to impose targeted sanctions against Israeli government officials who are responsible for violations. It's important for the UK to undertake a comprehensive review of its trade, military, security, and diplomatic relations with Israel, including by suspending the current UK-Israel trade partnership agreement and not enter into any free trade agreement with Israel as long as Israeli authorities are committing serious violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law. We are calling on the UK to ban trade with illegal settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. And talking about the banning of UNRWA, some people agree that the UK can do is to join Norway, which Norway is currently seeking a resolution by the UN General Assembly to ask for a binding and expedited ICJ advisory opinion on the banning of UNRWA. And it would be really great to see UK join Norway in this effort. And just to say that something that I have not had a chance to speak about today, but Israel is not only controlling what can enter Gaza, but has imposed severe restriction on who can leave Gaza. And UNICEF has said that it will take 7 years for the 2,500 children who need urgent medical care to be evacuated and to get treatment outside. And we are calling on the UK to press Israel to ensure that children and adults in need of medical treatment can indeed evacuate, and medical treatment that they cannot get in Gaza. And we are calling on the UK government, as other governments who have sophisticated healthcare system, to accept patients from Gaza and to work together with Palestinian and Israeli authorities to also ensure their right to return. And finally, in all of your public communication, I ask you to raise the alarm on the specific harms caused to children with disabilities. I've been doing this work for a year now and have been documented, and we're still in touch with all the children and families that I have interviewed. And the situation is just getting more catastrophic, worse day by day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Laura.
Yeah. Thank you. We've heard a bit about the challenges that pregnant women experience getting any support whatsoever. But could I ask Nabal in the first instance to talk a bit more about the impact of this conflict on women specifically?
So the impact of this ongoing war on women is truly indescribable. We're talking about women being killed first, as according to the figures, thousands of women were killed. They have lost also their children, and many thousand women became alone. So they have now to be the father, to take care of the children, to get the everyday struggle, which is to get little food for the children and to also bring water. Many women, they go hungry without eating to save the food for their families. Almost 60,000 pregnant women in Gaza are lacking everything. They are malnourished, not being able to receive the food they need, not even receiving the proper healthcare service they deserve. They are living in shelters. Thousands of people are sharing one a toilet, and you can't even imagine or relate how a pregnant woman have to endure in such inhuman conditions, being displaced, and not only once. Many women have been forced to flee multiple times. An average family had fled 3 or 4 or even 5 times. So these pregnant women are enduring very difficult conditions, where first there is ongoing bombardments. They have lost their family members and their loved ones. Many of them, they have lost their homes as it was already bombarded. They had forced to flee multiple times. And here when we talk about evacuating, most of the time the evacuation process is on foot. You have to walk very long distances on foot while rubble is everywhere. There is no transportation under very horrific and hard conditions to arrive any area, and then to find a shelter, which is usually, when we say shelter, there is no shelters. It's just the schools that it turns into places where people can stay, but there is no services. It's just a place where you can sleep in. And then, as I said, those daily struggles, even for a woman being in a tent. We have witnessed an increased number of infectious diseases being spreading among the internally displaced communities. This includes women and children as well. And unfortunately, because of the collapsing healthcare system, being a pregnant woman, you barely have the luxury to deliver your baby in a hospital if you were lucky enough. And if this happened, this means it's going to be almost in and out, where even the woman will not have the opportunity to stay at the hospital, which is already overcrowded with many patients. And sadly, tragically, many women have even dead C-sections without anesthesia because it was like run out. And it's one of the continuous struggles where hospitals lacking anesthesia, painkillers, and other basic medications and medical supplies.
Thank you. And Rohan, I think you've spoken to the committee previously about neonatal intensive care services being out of action. Has anything changed? What support is there if you...
Well, it's deteriorated further, I'm afraid to say. One of the last remaining neonatal intensive care units that was supported by MAPA for a long period of time, including during this crisis, was at the Kamal Adwan Hospital, which, as you've heard, is one of those hospitals that's now in the besieged north. The intensive care unit was essentially shut down because it wasn't possible to protect those babies now. They were, at the very early stages of the sort of intensified besiegement of North Gaza, evacuated down to the Patients' Friends Benevolent Society Hospital in Gaza City, which again is supported by MAP. We've done what we can to establish a sort of a jerry-rigged paediatric intensive care unit to care for those babies and others, but across the board, I'm afraid to say that that those services are simply not available in the way that they need to be and at the scale that they need to be to save the lives of the youngest and most vulnerable members of Gaza society.
I know this is perhaps for Emina. I know we've heard quite a bit already about the potential long-term impacts on people with disabilities, and particularly children with disabilities, and you raise potential long-term serious health consequences. Are there any other impacts that we should be mindful on people with people with disabilities that you'd like to raise?
Thank you so much. One thing that I haven't had a chance to mention is that it's really a vicious cycle, because what we documented is that due to Israel's use of explosive weapons within densely populated area, and it's something that, of course, UNICEF and Save the Children have reported in the past, thousands of children are acquiring disabilities, thousands of children and adults have been injured. And then they're facing this vicious cycle where more and more children and adults are acquiring a disability. And at the same time, they are at high risk of death and injury because of inability to flee, often due to lack of access to accessible and effective advance warnings that Israel should provide, the heavy destruction, unsanitary condition, living in makeshift camps where their basic needs cannot be met. And I often think about, again, the children that I have interviewed who have acquired a disability, and it has happened through traumatic amputation. And one child, Malik, he went with his mom to get food coupons in a shopping mall, so civilian infrastructure. And while there, an Israeli strike hit the shopping mall, and his mom told me that when she regained the consciousness, she was still holding her child's hand, and she started running. But at one point, she realized that her child's hand is light. And when she turned around, she realized that she's just holding his hand and that Malik was nowhere to be seen. And the reason why I wanted to bring Malik's stories here today is because I feel that people have gone used to hear that thousands of children have lost limbs in Gaza. But it's like when you come across a specific child and you understand the impact it has on them and how preventable all of that is and unnecessary. So that is one thing that I ask you to keep in mind, that it's not just children with disabilities who had disabilities prior to October 7th, but the thousands of them who have acquired a disability. And that's why we continue to call on the UK to suspend all arms exports to Israel, including indirectly through third countries.
Thank you. And lastly, could you just give some examples of how the Israeli border checks, dual-use checks, are impacting on children with disabilities?
So what we know is that since Israeli military took over the Rafah crossing, I think not more than like 237 people or patients have been allowed to leave Gaza. There are severe restrictions on access to treatment inside of Gaza. I mean, just to briefly mention, because there was a question about pregnant women, only 12 healthcare facilities in Gaza out of 36 hospitals that were functioning prior are able to provide some kind of healthcare to pregnant women. And even then, we know that women have been rushed out of hospitals really quickly. Going back, just imagine then if it's also a woman with a disability who is on top of that pregnant. And just to tie it back to the restrictions on what enters Gaza, but also can leave Gaza. And what we are also calling on governments who are working toward evacuation and who are pressuring Israel to allow patients from leaving Gaza, but also who are providing and offering beds and treatment in their home countries, is to include children with disabilities, because they're kind of like they've been left invisible. It's mostly been focused on injured children, but not children with disabilities. And the main restrictions that we know that exist is that even when Israeli authorities allow and give a permission for a child to leave Gaza, the permission is not extended to the immediate caregiver or other children in the family. And that's problematic because we definitely don't want to allow for any family separation. A family separation shouldn't be happening because it has its own psychological impacts on a child. And just as I mentioned earlier, just think about the numbers that have been provided by UN agencies. And the fact, I think it was only 2 weeks ago that UNICEF said, if Israel continues with the severe restrictions on evacuations, it will take 7 years for children who need urgent medical care to be able to leave.
Thank you. David?
Thank you, Chair. So just going back to one of the first questions that was asked by Monica around funding. Obviously, having an almost third of your budget cut by the US pulling out, what's UNRWA's thinking at the moment in terms of President-elect Trump coming in, the new administration, and whether the funding will be recommenced, or are you just going to have to do with what you have at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, one that I'm not really able to talk on, given, not wanting to involve and engage in domestic politics of a member state. We know what happened under the previous Trump administration in terms of the withholding of funding from UNRWA, and also unilateral measures that were taken at that time. So we're concerned. We're very concerned that the current suspension of funding may continue. We hope that it doesn't, but beyond that, there's not much more that I can say.
Thank you. Have you got a follow-up? I'm looking around. Your evidence today has had a profound impact on this committee, as you can see. I'm sure it has also had a profound impact on the people watching it, and it's our duty to make sure it has had a profound impact on the decision makers as well. We may well come back to you for additional evidence or for clarifications, but on behalf of the whole committee, can I please say thank you so much for making the time. I know you have an awful lot of pressures on all of you, not of your own making right now, and so it has been very, very generous of you to come and speak to us. May I give my deepest sympathies to all of you that have lost colleagues, that have been directly impacted by this. and also have been indirectly impacted by trying to support your colleagues through the most difficult time any of us can imagine. We really, really appreciate that you do get up every morning and that you do keep on fighting for those civilians who need our support more than ever before. Thank you all. Thank you, committee. Order, order. This session is now closed.